So how about we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, sure.
Welcome everyone. Again, as Kristen said, we want to welcome you to our webinar tonight, Making Learning Meaningful this school year. We're so excited that you're with us tonight, and we think we've got some good stuff for you. So I'm Joe Tilley. I work full-time for the Center for Responsive Schools in the Programs Department. I'm a curriculum and instructional designer. Coming to you tonight from Nashville, Tennessee, where it's been raining a little bit today and just kind of overcast now. So the rain has stopped for the moment. So I'm grateful for that. Couple of things just to know for the logistics of the webinar. As you can tell with the chat function, you have the opportunity to send chats to either Emily and Kristen and I individually or to everyone. So if you put anything in the chat box, please be conscious of who you're sending it to. And we do welcome positive comments throughout the evening. We would love for that to go through. Just remember who can see it. With that said, we are going to use the chat function quite a bit tonight, so make sure you're familiar with that. If you're not, it's going to be down in your toolbar at the bottom. Also in the toolbar at the bottom, you have a question and answer function. You are welcome to open that up anytime during the webinar and send a question. It'll come to me. I'm going to act as the wizard behind the curtain tonight. So I'll be kind of conducting the logistics of everything tonight. So that question will come to me. If it's something that I can answer, I will answer it to you directly. If not, I'll pose it to Kristen and Emily. We'll also be putting some links as we're going through tonight into the chat function. And so when those are referenced, just make sure that you catch those. Also remember the chat function scrolls. And so if you lose that link, you'll have to scroll back up and try to find it and that sort of thing. So at this time, I am going to mute myself and I'm going to allow Kristen to introduce herself.
Thanks, Joe. We're happy to have you here helping us out tonight. My name is Kristen Vincent. I'm the Assistant Director of Marketing at the Center for Responsive Schools. I was a classroom teacher for many years. I taught 4th grade in an inclusive classroom just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I've done a lot of work for the Center for Responsive Schools. So I've been a responsive classroom certified instructor, and one of my former students is on here tonight. And so I've traveled around teaching responsive classroom workshops across the United States. And now I've transitioned into this position of Assistant Director of Marketing. I'm also an author of several books for the Center for Responsive Schools. So I'm the author of Closing Circles, 50 Activities to End the Day in a Positive Way. Oh, Emily has copies of them. The Joyful Classroom, Practical Ways to Engage and Challenge Students, grades K to 6. And the book that we're going to talk about tonight, Make Learning Meaningful. So I'm excited to be here. And I'm going to pass it on to Emily so she can introduce herself.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here too, and excited to have the chance to talk more with Kristen about this exciting book that we are releasing really soon, coming out in October. So my name is Emily Hemingway, and I'm the editor-in-chief at Center for Responsive Schools, which means that my job is to work with talented educators and writers like Kristen and like Joe, and to create resources that we hope are useful and interesting and inspiring for educators. I think it's a really fun job, and I am honored to be here tonight to talk more about some of our books. But before I was editor-in-chief at CRS, I was an educator and an administrator in independent schools out here in Western Mass, where I'm currently sitting in the middle of some thunderstorms. And part of my role in that junior boarding school was living as a dorm parent with students. So I was a teacher and an administrator, but I think dorm parent is maybe the more unusual role. So I lived in dorms with 4th through 9th graders for many, many years. But I always think about that in connection with this book because Kristen does such a great job in Make Learning Meaningful, talking about the natural learning cycle in the classroom, but also outside the classroom. And so as a dorm parent, you know, you're seeing the classroom side of things, and then you're seeing the home side of things, just like a biological parent. So we're going to talk about all that and more as we get into it tonight.
I'm excited to be here tonight, and I know everybody has it's going to be a treat for everybody. Before we get started, I just want to double check if you could, in the chat function, just let me know yes that you can see the slides that are currently being projected, or the slide that is currently being projected. Perfect. Just want to make sure that everybody can see the same thing. A couple of other things, just housekeeping issues or housekeeping things. We are going to be giving away some books tonight, and I think that's going to come up pretty quick. And so be paying attention to that to have an opportunity to win one of these fantastic resources. And then lastly, there will be a recording of this. It's going to be available for free on the Responsive Classroom website, as well as on the YouTube channel. And so with that said, I'm going to turn my camera off, mute myself, and be in the background here while Emily takes over.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. And Joe, yeah, you can move out of these slides for now. So it's just us on the screen.
Just us. I'm so excited. That's great. All right, Kristen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So I wanted to start off just kind of setting the scene a little bit with this book. So Make Learning Meaningful, it's all about leveraging the natural learning cycle, K-8 classrooms. So what is the natural learning cycle? Can you start us with the very basics?
Sure. The natural learning cycle is how we learn. So the natural learning cycle happens at all ages when we're learning something new or developing a new skill. And young children and even babies are learning in cycles in the years before they even attend school. So you can think about the developmental milestones of infants and toddlers, such as like turning their head to follow a sound, or learning to move across the floor and crawl and eventually walk. A lot of this occurs with very little direct instruction or intervention. We may like kind of hold, an infant's hands to kind of like move them in one direction, or we might, help them stand up. But when you're not there, they're still trying to do that. And they're doing that on their own. And they're in this cycle of trying to move, failing, and trying again, right? So lots of falling down when kids are learning to walk. But they get back up and do it again. And they're in this cycle of having a goal and reaching towards it and making mistakes and trying again. And we can think about how we do other things in our lives that are in the natural learning cycle. So I was just reflecting on this, like if I'm riding a bicycle, learning how to ride a bicycle, kids definitely go through a lot of experiments and failures with that. But even when you're cooking a new recipe, I think about my teenage daughter getting ready to drive and all those things that you need to go through to learn how to drive a car. And then even I was thinking about some of the students that I've worked with and learning very specific social and emotional skills, where maybe they're learning how to greet someone with eye contact or advocating for themselves. There really is, it's not like a straight line, like there really is some experimentation that happens there and some mistakes and some reflection that can happen. So the natural learning cycle is like following the brain's natural path when we're teaching ourselves something or learning something. So it's a process of experience and reflection. So that's why we call it natural, because it's kind of the way our brain is wired. And it's spontaneously what we're going to do when we're teaching ourselves something that we really want to learn. And then the natural learning cycle consists of 3 phases. So you would generate ideas and goals. And then you're actively working to reach those goals. And then there's some time for reflection, where you think about what worked, what didn't work. Do you want to try that again? Do you want to go back? And it's not always happening where you just have a goal, you work, and you reflect. Sometimes you have a goal and you start to work and you realize, oh, this isn't working, and you go back and refine your goal. Or sometimes you're working and you're reflecting and working, reflecting and working, reflecting. You're kind of stuck in between those 2 phases for a while before you go back to, try something new. So the learning cycle can be used for teaching anything. I was thinking about curriculum like math and science and reading, but it can also be used to teach strategies for discipline and following the rules, for social emotional learning, and that's what we share we share that in the book too.
That's
Yeah.
great. It's so interesting to think about mistake making with the natural learning cycle, and the way you just described it is it's such an important part of the process. Your brain you have to try and fail or try and not quite succeed at your goal to build that motivation and to like get yourself onto the right path. And so often it's hard for kids and adults to want to make mistakes or to feel like that's an okay part of the process as much as we say that it's okay.
Yeah, and we do say that a lot, like as educators in the classroom, but then yet you still see that hesitancy from your students, or, you know, for me as an educator, if I said to my fourth graders, yeah, sure, make all the mistakes you want, but realize I'm like, wait a minute, but we have to get going on, like, we have to move on. Like, we can't just spend all day like making mistakes. So it's like, kind of like, how do you balance that out? Yeah, it's hard to make a mistake and think it's okay.
Well, so that kind of leads to my next question then. So how can an educator really use that natural learning cycle? How can you make time for it? Or maybe a better question is, why should you? Why is it okay to maybe spend that time making mistakes and failing a little bit before you get to what we think of as the end goal?
Yeah, so I'm going to read, I just pulled out like a quote from the preface of the book that I'm going to read it. I think it kind of like sums up why the natural learning cycle is important for us as educators. The natural learning cycle is not a new strategy or practice in education. Your students have most likely been engaging in the natural learning cycle since birth. However, when children begin their formal schooling, usually around the age of 5, the natural learning cycle is often replaced with other teacher-directed models of instruction. So the result is often that natural curiosity and exploration is diminished as students complete curriculum work assigned by an adult with learning goals created by someone else. So the idea of using the natural learning cycle with students is to shift away from like compliance-based learning strategies that aren't always in alignment with how our brains are going to work and move through that cycle. So we want to allow students the chance to practice and develop the skills they need to be that active participant. So this really helps educators keep the teaching and learning really student focused. And the other reason that I think it's really important for educators is that I share in the book that the natural learning cycle is a key for unlocking intrinsic motivation. And I use this line in the book that we teach human beings, not subjects. So we're there to teach the students. We're there to teach them to learn math. I'm not necessarily there to teach them social studies, but they're there to learn social studies. And it's that process of learning. It's not just the teaching of content that's so important. So in the natural learning cycle, we want to provide students opportunities to experiment and practice, make mistakes, have chances to start over, and to share in the control of their own learning. So we all have the need to feel like we belong and to feel competent. And when we don't feel like we have control over our learning or feel like we're getting a sense of mastery, we might not feel really good about our learning. And again, those feelings can sort of compile up, and then you're not feeling good about yourself as a student. So if we can unlock intrinsic motivation within our students, they'll be more engaged. They'll be excited to learn. So some of the things that the natural learning cycle helps us do as educators is help our students see a connection to what they're learning and make a connection to their own lives. It does give them some chance to have some autonomy to share in decision making so that they're setting goals or they're thinking about how they're going to work on what it is that they want to learn. You're definitely giving them purpose. So there's a reason why they're learning what they're learning, and it's very clear to them why they're learning that topic or that skill. And again, it allows for some mastery for them to see it all the way to the end and to have some fun along the way, because they're going to have a chance to like engage and practice, and gets a little messy. Maybe they can move around the room and talk to each other. And so in that way, that builds intrinsic motivation. So only a few of those elements have to be present for students to experience an increase in intrinsic motivation. And the natural learning cycle has a lot of those elements built right in. So purpose, mastery, fun, connection, autonomy are built right in there. So those are some of the reasons why I think it's important as an educator to know about it.
I'm so glad you brought up motivation, because when you were sharing the natural learning cycle in infants and just sort of that development that you see those milestones being reached, there's so much motivation to do those things. There's so much joy in achieving those milestones. And so much of what we see students being really enthusiastic about are those things that they're deeply engaged in. They're so excited to learn more and they want to be part of that cycle. They don't mind making mistakes because they're working towards something that they're really engaged and committed to. And so that motivation is so important. I see it in adults. I feel it in myself when I'm learning something. If it's something I really want to do, there's so much more motivation. So having that be part of the natural learning cycle is a really powerful thing.
And I've heard from educators, I've had educators ask, like, how do you make students be more motivated?
Yeah.
And I think that all students are motivated. Like I have that belief that all students want to learn and can learn, that it's inside of them. And as educators, we have to create the conditions to pull the intrinsic motivation out, to foster it, to grow inside of them. So the way we structure our lessons can really pull that motivation out of them versus it's something that we're like giving them. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So then as educators are using the natural learning cycle, leveraging it in their classrooms, and their students are engaged in it, how do you know that it's working? What are you seeing in your students to like know that this is happening for them and to help them move through those stages? Motivation is one part of it, probably.
Yeah. And I think, so I think you would see students actively engaged in their work and not asking, when is this over, or what time is lunch, or like they're saying things like, oh, I can't wait to get back to work on that tomorrow, or oh, look what I discovered, or look what I found. Or even if they find something frustrating about it, by the time they get to the reflection phase, they're like, oh, that was so hard, but they got something out of it. Yeah. And I was thinking about this, and I think that the role of the teacher is so important in the natural learning cycle, because the teacher, you're there sort of as a coach to guide them along. And so observation is really important, like noting students who might need more support while they're working, students who are having a hard time getting started, some that seem frustrated. You're there to kind of push them along and ask questions and redirect them. And by having those little moments with students while they're working, you can really listen and see where they are in their natural learning cycle. And I just think that, the role of the teacher being there to support, but you're not giving the answers. They're making that meaning, which is ties to the title of the book.
Absolutely. And fun for the teacher too, I think. I mean, sometimes it's hard not to step in. You have to make sure that you're observing and you're really engaged in that role, but you get to watch the motivation happening in your students, and can be really fantastic.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So I think we're ready to do a book giveaway.
Yeah. So
I'm super excited. And this is really a fun way to kind of share some ideas with each other too. So if everyone wants to make sure their chat is set to everyone, because that way we can kind of share some ideas with each other. And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just randomly going to pick 2 people who answer this question in the chat. And Joe, if you're still with us, do you want to put up the slide so people can see the question that we're going to answer? Thanks. It is like behind the scenes. So in the chat, why don't you share with us something that you think you learned through the natural learning cycle? Like think back, or maybe it's something recent, like if you've just like learned a new recipe or taken on a new hobby during COVID, knitting or something. Is there something that you've learned through the natural learning cycle? And if your name in the if your name in the that shows up in the chat is just like a first initial or just your first name. If you could type your first and last name, then that way it's easier to call on someone if there's more than 2 Jennifers here or something like that. Oh, Phoebe, that's a good one. Classroom management. Definitely learning how to do that as a novice teacher. Gardening, lots of gardening. Yeah.
Training a puppy, absolutely. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. Training a dog is like a lifetime of natural learning cycle, right? Parenting teens, Rachel, I hear you. Definitely. Yeah.
Right, lots of new hobbies people are starting in this pandemic too. That's great.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So I'm gonna jot down 2 names. All right, so I've chosen 2 people from all of you that have answered here in the chat, and it's Susan Scott and Karen Bause, I think is how you say your last name, B-A-U-S-E. And so what I'd like both of you to do, congratulations, is in the Q&A feature, if you could share with us your full name and your full mailing address when these books are ready to ship. We won't have them till the beginning of October. When they're ready to ship, we will ship each of you a copy of the book. So that was Susan Scott and Karen Bause or Bose. And yeah, in the Q&A, just send us your name and address. And congratulations, we're super excited for you. That's great. And I'm just zooming through this chat here, just kind of scrolling through it. There's some really great ideas in here. Someone has taught a rabbit to be potty trained.
That's awesome.
Learning a new language. And Julie spent quarantine procrastinating. I love it. I love all these new terms that have come out. Great. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Susan. I see your address is there. So that's great. So Joe, we can come out of these slides while we continue to chat. Emily and I chat. Thank you.
Great. You can hear the enthusiasm and the motivation too, and what the different things people were learning through the natural learning cycle. Such a range, but lots of engagement. That's great.
Yeah, and some I think from when people were like little, and some recent as an adult. So yeah.
Well, and I feel like we're in a nice position because we've read the book, right? So I'm excited for folks to have a chance to read the book. But one of the things that the book has done for me is really bring my awareness to when I'm learning something new and what I'm doing as I'm learning it. So that's all thanks to you. But that's such an important part, that awareness and then the reflection. So we'll get to that. But before we get to that part of the book, can you tell me a little bit about why you wanted to write this book? Where did this idea come from?
So the ideas and strategies in the book come from the responsive classroom approach. That's kind of like the seed where this all started. And it's, so I wrote a book called The Joyful Classroom. And in that book, which Emily has.
I happen to have right here. I just keep your books near me at all times.
Thank you.
It's a great book.
And in that book, I did talk about the natural learning cycle. One of the practices of responsive classroom is academic choice. And academic choice follows the natural learning cycle. So there's a goal for students for learning. They're going to work during that, and they have some choice as to what they're going to do, how they're going to learn it, maybe the content that they're going to learn. And then there's some reflection at the end of an academic choice lesson. And so in the Joyful Classroom, I talk very briefly about the natural learning cycle and then launch into talking about academic choice and how to provide more choice for your students in their learning. And so I was approached by a staff member, it was almost 2 years ago now, about this idea of expanding upon the natural learning cycle that was just touched upon in the Joyful Classroom. And she said, just take that idea and expand on it. And I was like, for a whole book? I just saw it as something small that was a part of academic choice. And So it wasn't easy for me at first to like conceptualize this book, because it's something that we naturally do. So like, how do you explain that? So I was finding it challenging. So I had to go through my own natural learning cycle for a while to figure out like what we wanted to say about the natural learning cycle, and how to connect it to how students learn, how to connect it to different practices and strategies that we use in the classroom. So I kind of just thought of it as like the natural learning cycle is sort of like the umbrella, and you can plug a lot of things into it. So like the academic choice structure follows, this, but I was also thinking about like readers workshop and writers workshop really follows this model where there's a goal, kids are working, and you have some kind of reflection at the end where they can share their work or share about their work. And then in thinking about that, and thinking about what we do with responsive classroom, it's not just about social emotional learning, it's about academics and discipline. And so we decided to have some sections in the book talking about using the natural learning cycle to teach academic content, but also discipline related skills and strategies, and then social emotional learning competencies.
So can you tell everybody how the book is actually structured? Because I think it's an interesting way that you've divided up what you
we divided it up. I didn't come up with these ideas all on my own. But the book is presented in two parts. So the first 4 chapters describe the natural learning cycle and the conditions in which it can best be leveraged or best be used. So if someone were to take the natural learning cycle and use it, it could be effective with students, but it's more effective if you can kind of set the stage for that. So it's about like creating a positive learning community where it's okay to make mistakes, like we talked about earlier, in looking at the language that we use with our students and making sure that they feel encouraged and that they feel empowered to take on their own learning goals, and teaching students about working independently in the classroom. So it's a lot of sort of setting up the conditions. And then the second half of the book, chapters 5, 6, and 7 are about what I just said. Like there are some sample lessons for teaching discipline and discipline related skills, for academic content, and then for using the natural learning cycle to teach social and emotional skills. And in the examples, they're at all different grade levels from grades K to 8. And some of them show or illustrate the natural learning cycle from beginning to end, like in a kindergarten class. And then some of the lessons just really highlight a specific part of the natural learning cycle. So some of the lessons are just a spotlight on the reflection phase or a spotlight on the working phase and the role of the teacher in that phase. So just trying to switch it up a little bit and kind of highlight some of those important parts of the natural learning cycle. I just want to give a shout out to our designer, Elizabeth Green, for designing the cover, and the way she laid out the inside of the book is really clever, using color and using some of the graphics from the cover to carry through the book. It's just, I think it's a really pretty book. I
think so too. Yeah.
Team effort on that part. So yeah,
really makes it all the more beautiful to read. And the content is wonderful too.
Easy to read though.
I love the lessons, and you have this sort of like spotlight into classrooms so that you're like, as a reader, you're reading how to do it, but then you get to really see how it's done and see that example. And it helps so much as a teacher to you're not just like reading the directions or reading the philosophy behind it, but you're seeing it in action through your words. And it makes such a difference. And seeing how 5-year-olds can do it and 12-year-olds can do it, and what that looks like in different situations. It's really powerful. And the parts about discipline, especially, I think, to, that idea of teaching discipline and how do you do it? How do you really leverage what kids do naturally and help them set goals and motivate them? So.
Yeah, I would say that was like the most challenging part for me, because it was so easy to think about academics, because off the heels of Joyful Classroom, it's all about the strategies for academics in the classroom, engaging academics, and to think like usually discipline strategies like come from the teacher and you're just sort of telling the kids like what to do and how to do it when they're following the rules. So to think that you want to kind of maybe take them through a cycle of learning some of those skills, I had to really think about that and think about how that would fit into different types of classrooms and with different grades of students. And but to me, that type of learning seems like it would be much more meaningful for the student and sort of like a way for them to internalize those skills so that they can be better at following the rules.
Yeah. In the same way that we want academic learning to be engaging and motivating, it can be the same, when you're learning social and emotional skills, or you're learning how to behave in a classroom, or what the most effective behavior is. So there's one other structural part of the book that I think is really unique and very helpful. We've talked a little bit about reflection already tonight, but at the end of each chapter, you have this great feature really for the teacher, for the reader, about their own natural learning cycle. Can you talk a little about that and why that was important to you to include?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I ended up including this reflection section at the end of every chapter is because I was doing that when I was writing the book. So I was definitely in my own natural learning cycle. And then in talking to you and our project editor, Kevin, thinking how the reader might be going through a natural learning cycle while they read about the natural learning cycle. So kind of like that, thinking about your thinking, which we often do as educators when we're learning something new, and we are learning something that then we want to teach to our students, but we're experiencing it at the same time. So I think that you'll probably go through your own natural learning cycle reading the book. So I wanted to highlight that and bring awareness to the process. So, and also acknowledge that it can feel overwhelming when you're reading a book and thinking about trying something new. So along the way, I try to offer encouragement and kind of say, well, at this point, you might be feeling this, and that's okay. And just kind of offer the support that you might need along the way as you're thinking about trying the natural learning cycle with your students.
I love that, because so often when you're reading a book like that as an educator, you're kind of doing that self-awareness on your own. You have to take that extra step and do that extra work, and you provide a structure for that for the reader already, which is so nice. And it does, kind of prompt you to go through that thinking and really pause before you move on. So you're not taking on too much, you're stopping to think and reflect.
Yeah. I think it's important to do that when we're learning something new, or even when I was writing to write something, step away, reflect, come back. So yeah. So I'd like to give away 2 more copies of the book. Let's do it. So let's see, what is this is a great question, and I'm really excited to see what everyone types into the chat. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'll just pick 2 people randomly who answer the question in the chat. The question is, and Joe, you can put that up whenever you're ready to put that slide up. The question is, wait for him to put it up. What is a feature that you like to have in a book that was written and designed for educators? And Emily is going to take note of this because
I have a pen. That is what we aim for. So this is really helpful for me.
I know. So I'll get a download of the chat. So I'll send it to you, Emily.
That's great.
With all these ideas. But what's a feature you like to have in a book that was written and designed for educators? I know, like, I'm a very visual person, so I like things organized in a visual way. Bullet points. I love bullet points. Looks like examples is something that people really like. Yeah. Drawings. Yeah.
Discussion questions. That's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, so many great ideas.
I know.
This is a tough one, Kristen.
I know. But I've got a couple names. So Becky Royal or Royale, I'm not sure how to say your last name, and Jane Liu. I would like to give you both a copy of the book. So if you could type into the question and answers feature your full name and your home address when the books are ready to ship, we will send you both a copy. So that's Becky Royal and Jane Liu.
Congratulations.
That's great. Yeah, congrats.
Kristen, while we are waiting on them to send that in the question, we had a couple of questions come in that I think that everyone would enjoy hearing the answers to.
Sure.
And so the first one is, and I think that this can be either to you or Emily. I think it would be applicable to either. Do you have a favorite children's book about making mistakes or falling down and getting back up?
Oh, that's a great question.
That
I'm
is a
putting
good
you on the
question.
spot.
I know. I'm not prepared.
There's one that comes to mind for me. I think it's called The Most Magnificent Thing. It's a picture book that I've used before, and I think it's a little girl who's trying and trying again, and it's not working, and just coming up with new approaches. Magical,
And
that's a great one.
magical. I was going to say, I'm going to turn this right back to all of our attendees who are here on the webinar, who are like in it in their classrooms teaching. Feel free to drop in some titles there. I can't think of one off the top of my head.
That's a good question. I think
it's a great question. Yeah.
It is a great question. I think it's also a great idea to just allow people to share the ones that they're thinking of as well. And then, Kristen, this one came in, and I think this one's kind of in your wheelhouse. But what changes or challenges have you noticed within the natural learning cycle in regards to the pandemic?
Well, I think for students that had to transition to online learning for most of the year, I think that for using the natural learning cycle over a screen is hard because part of what makes the natural learning cycle so powerful is the role of the teacher. When students are working in the classroom, you're there to have little side conversations with them, to whisper encouragement, to look over their shoulder, look at their work, watch them how they're sitting, allow them flexibility in the classroom to move around, to work with a partner, to work by themselves. And on a screen, you lose some of that because you can't really look over their shoulder because their work is down here. And having those one-on-one little interactions around their work sometimes is hard to have on a screen. So I would say that that's something that I think is hard to do with the natural learning cycle over the screen. But otherwise, in person, there's a lot. You can do it socially distanced and masked. That's, that totally works in the classroom there. I would just say that online learning just makes it more challenging. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Great questions.
Yeah.
Before I have a couple more questions for you, Kristen, but this last giveaway question, as I was looking at everybody's great ideas for features in books, just reminded me that it's a good time to mention that your book also has a discussion guide that comes with it. It's a free download that's on our bookstore page. So a few people mentioned how much they like having those discussion questions, and we do too. So that's in addition to the reflections at the end of the chapter, which are really sort of for your own metacognitive approach to reading the book. We also have the discussion guide. That's questions you can answer yourself, or if you're reading the book with a small group or in a professional learning group, something like that, you can use those. So it's my little plug for our website page, and that download is available now. So
yeah, if you go to, and I think Joe can drop some links into the chat for us, but the Responsive Classroom website has a bookstore, and you can find this book there. And then on that page is a place to find free discussion questions for the book. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So a couple more questions for you. So I wanted to kind of transition into your life as a writer. That, of course, is how I know you the most, is as a writer. And already that I have your books here with me. So these two other great resources that you've written. And I want to celebrate the fact that this is your third book that's coming out with Center for Responsive Schools. And that's a huge accomplishment. And I'm curious if you've talked a little bit about the natural learning cycle as a writer, there are aspects of it in academic choice in the Joyful Classroom. Will readers see aspects of the natural learning cycle and closing circles, do you think? Are there connections in there?
Yeah, this so great question. So that whole reflection piece is really important. It's in both of those books. So we talk a lot about reflection in the Joyful Classroom and have a lot of like sample questions there. Same thing with closing circles, because when you close the day, closing circle is a way to end the day, and you want to have some celebration and some reflection. And so there are reflection activities in there, reflection questions for all different grades to, play games or do all kinds of activities where you can kind of think about what you learned, how you learned, did you make a mistake today, what went well today, those kinds of things. I think, the Joyful Classroom touches on the natural learning cycle, also like lesson structures where you would want to, open your lesson, have that time to work, and then wrap it up with reflection, have a closing on a lesson. All of the books also touch upon teacher language and interactive modeling as strategies for setting students up for success. So using teacher language to encourage students, to redirect them if they're off track, and to model for them the behaviors that you're looking for from them, or to model the skills so that they can be successful and more independent while they're learning. I can give an example of something that's in the Joyful Classroom that I expanded on a little bit in this book, the Make Learning Meaningful, is the idea of checking in with students and asking first before you offer a student some help. So the idea, I'm like a control freak. And so I would just want to jump in and be like, here's how you do it. Like, just do it this way, just fix it this way. And really learning how to step back and ask a student, would you like some help with that? Or can I offer you a suggestion that's helped other fourth graders? Because it's the student's work, it's not mine. And I feel like there's so much learning that can happen in that struggle. So if a student is off track or they're struggling, or I think there's a lot of learning that can happen there. And so I often would ask, would you like some help with that? Or can I tell you what other fourth graders have done when they get stuck like that? And if a student says yes, I'll help them. But if they say no, not right now, or no, thank you, I'll just step back and keep an eye on them and observe them and check in periodically to see how things are going. But I believe if the work is appropriately challenging, the student can learn a lot from working through that independently. And then if you notice a student continues to struggle, that also gives you a lot of information to find some time, set aside some time, check in with them. Maybe the goal just wasn't set appropriately for them, or but I think as educators, we kind of have to resist the urge to fix everything all at once. So that's something that I have in the Joyful Classroom that I also was able to carry over into this book too.
Even asking the question in that way gives the child that agency too, and the moment to think, like, do I need help, or do I want to try it one more time, and then recognize when I need to seek help. That's a great social emotional skill, even in an academic setting. That's awesome.
Right. And what looks like struggling to me, the student might be like, no, I'm fine. Like, basically, like, why are you here asking me this question? I thought everything was going great. But I might be like, it's a disaster, but they're like, this is great. And so there's like, you get some good information from them.
Absolutely. Power of observation.
Exactly.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me think about it. So you have this great background as an educator, obviously, before you wrote any of these books. Can you say a little bit about just how that impacts what you write, or how you structure a book, what you're including?
Sure. So I would say the biggest influence on like what I'm writing is the responsive classroom approach, and how I've used that to structure the teaching and learning in my own classroom and setting up a positive learning environment for them. And you don't have to know anything about the responsive classroom approach in order to pick up this book and learn something from it. So we did that purposefully to kind of be like, this book is accessible to anyone. And we do talk about responsive classroom practices in there just because they do help you set students up for success. So that's always like influencing me, always kind of thinking about the proactive and then like reactive side of things. But I would say like observing in classrooms and working with educators across the United States, watching students and watching teachers and seeing what teaching strategies prompted engagement from students. Looking at what like discipline practices or teacher language would really bring out the best in students. One of the jobs as a responsive classroom consulting teacher is I get to go to schools when they're in session and observe for a day and sit in the back of lots of different classrooms and watching the students and watching the teacher and listening and just taking in the whole sense of the room and the lesson. And so that has really helped me kind of step back and see like what strategies the teacher's using that really bring out the best in students. And then something else that has impacted me, especially writing this book, is some people might not know this, but I started my teaching career in museum education. So it was a minor in my undergraduate work, and I worked as an educator at the New England Aquarium in Boston. And I learned about engagement and how to engage both adults and children, how to capture their attention and sustain it long enough to like pick up little bits of knowledge, or how to help someone take prior knowledge and put it into new learning. So someone might come to the aquarium and have like misconceptions about like sharks or penguins or something. And then we're like, no, actually, like, you know, and try to give them some new information, and they're trying to like make sense of that. And then the power of observation. Like I had a lot of time when I was working there just to watch visitors and see how they interact with an exhibit or interact with something, to see their level of engagement. Like, what are they just like walking right by and not paying attention to at all? And like, what is causing them to stop and look and go, ooh, or ah, or that's cool. Because that's what we want to have happen in the classroom. We don't want our students just to sit there passively, you know, breezing by the math and the reading that we're teaching. We want them to be like, ooh, it's so exciting. So I feel like that foundation for me really helped me build kind of that piece of thinking about engagement for students.
That is such a cool job, by the way. And I know that that's not what this webinar is about, but I have so many other questions. That's really such an interesting way to think about engagement with students too. And what a challenge as an educator with you could never predict who's going to be in your group. And so to come up with ways to engage and educate such a range of people that's good exercise right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really, it's hard work. It's very hard work, and shout out to any museum educator.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about reflection and the importance of reflection as an educator, and of course in the classroom with students. So I want to end with a final question sort of about your own reflection on your writing, and ask you how you've experienced your own natural learning cycle, either in Make Learning Meaningful in the process of writing that, or in any of your library of books, your 3 books. What have you learned from that process?
Well, I've learned that the natural learning cycle can take over a year to be in. And I think setting goals is super important. Creating goals, creating a strong outline, like a strong direction on where you're headed is really important. I didn't really think it was. I just thought, yeah, you know, I kind of want to do this, but really getting specific about it can help shape the whole rest of the work. So I made many book outlines for this book before I even got started. So I also learned that stepping away from it and then coming back to it. So giving that time for reflection, sometimes stepping away from it for an hour or maybe a couple of days and coming back and rereading what I wrote. I was like, oh, did I really write that? Like, oh, because in the moment you're like, I don't know if this is any good, or oh, you get frustrated with it. And then you come back to it with like a fresh perspective. And something else that I've learned about writing books is that feedback is really, really important. So making sure that all along the way you're getting feedback. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Michelle Gill, who gave a lot of feedback on this book, and her perspectives were definitely refreshing and helped clarify some messages in the book. to help target them for classroom teachers. And that feedback, while sometimes receiving feedback can be hard because you're like, I'm done with that. And then they're like, wait a minute though, like, yeah, so it's so good. It just elevated the book and makes it that much better. So feedback is really, really important. And then one of my favorite sayings, and I do share this in the book, is to go slow to go fast. So you kind of have to take your time in the beginning to set that up. I don't want to say correctly, but set it up thoughtfully so that later on you can move quickly, like it does go smoothly. So I feel like writing this book did feel a little slow, but it was deliberate. It was deliberately slow to make sure that, we were getting it right and saying what we wanted to say.
Absolutely. And what a fantastic final product you created. So I'm so excited for everybody to see it and to get to dive into their own natural learning cycle the way we have been as we've been working on this book, because it's been a great cycle, great ride.
Yeah, it's been really, really great. So as we mentioned before, the book is available for pre-order from the Responsive Classroom website. We think they'll be here beginning of October.
Yeah.
Joe, if you just want to put up that last slide, we can just share about the next webinar that's coming up. We're trying to do webinars every month, and some months we have 2. They're super fun for us to work on, and we really enjoy connecting with everyone in this way. And so, there's the website for ordering the book and checking it out on the Responsive Classroom bookstore. And then our next webinar is going to be Thursday, October 14th. And this is about the power of observation. So really using observation to see your students, to learn more about your students. And we have a really great panel of speakers who work in various roles in schools. So thinking about observation from the point of view of an assistant principal or from an instructional leader, and thinking about how observation helps them get to know their students and do the best that they can. So you can register for that on our website. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's really fun to see you all come up with your ideas in the chat. And Joe, thank you so much for running the behind the scenes. I appreciate it. And we have you got those addresses jotted down so we can.
Yep, I'm going to email you as soon as we're done. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. So we will ship out those. So congratulations. And Emily, thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I want to mention, Joe put some great links in the chat. And one of them, the first one there is to an issue of our Journal of Social and Emotional Learning. And Kristen has an article in that delves more into the book and the natural learning cycle. So a great read.
Yeah. And then there'll be another article coming up in the next issue of the Journal of Social and Emotional Learning, which will have a couple sample lesson plans from the book. So you'll see how those lessons are laid out. So if you want to subscribe to that, there's a link there and you can subscribe. It's free and you get some benefits for joining and being a subscriber of the Journal of Social and Emotional Learning. Thank you so much, everyone. We totally appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Emily. Great information. It's a great resource. I encourage everybody to get it. Tell your friends. Make sure everybody knows. But it's fantastic. You'll love it.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.
All right,
everybody.
take care.
Bye now.
Bye.